Sometimes the loneliest people make the most desperate promises. Sometimes those promises change everything in ways no one expects. Miss Eleanor Price had spent years teaching in Red Creek, watching other women find husbands while she grew older alone. When 3 drunk men cornered her and mocked her for being unwed, fear made her say the unthinkable. "Don't hurt me, I'll give you sons." The biggest man there was Wyatt Kane, a cowboy feared across the territory. Everyone expected him to take her offer. Instead, he placed his hand on her shoulder and said something that shocked the whole town. What could this dangerous man want from a schoolteacher that had nothing to do with marriage? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The brass bell that hung beside Eleanor's desk had belonged to her mother, carried west in a wagon train 23 years ago. Each morning at 8 o'clock sharp, Eleanor stepped onto the schoolhouse porch and rang it 3 times, calling the children of Red Creek to their lessons. The sound carried across the dusty main street, past the general store where men gathered to discuss cattle prices and rainfall, past the saloon where different men gathered for different reasons, all the way to the church at the end of town where Reverend Morrison would pause in his morning prayers and smile. Red Creek sat in a valley between 2 ranges of hills, protected from the worst of the prairie winds, but not from the harsh realities of frontier life. The town had grown around a reliable water source, a creek that ran year-round, fed by springs higher in the hills. Ranchers had settled here first, then merchants to serve them, then families seeking the stability that came with established businesses and steady work. By 1887, Red Creek boasted a population of nearly 300 souls, large enough to support a school, a church, a doctor, and 2 saloons. Eleanor had arrived in Red Creek 5 years earlier, fresh from a teaching college in Denver, carrying letters of recommendation and her mother's Bible. The town had needed a teacher badly. Their previous schoolmaster had departed suddenly after a disagreement with the town council over his fondness for whiskey during school hours. Eleanor's credentials were impeccable, her references glowing, and her willingness to work for modest wages made her an attractive candidate. What the town hadn't bargained for was hiring a woman who would remain unmarried past the age when such things were expected to resolve themselves naturally. At 26, Eleanor had received exactly 3 marriage proposals during her time in Red Creek. The first had come from Harold Pettigrew, the bank clerk, a thin, nervous man who approached marriage the same way he approached his ledgers, with careful calculation and obvious reluctance. The second had been from Samuel Morrison, the Reverend's son, who seemed more interested in acquiring a helpmate for his planned missionary work than a wife to cherish. The third proposal had come just last month from Chester Hawthorne, a widower with 5 children who made it clear he needed a housekeeper more than a companion. Eleanor had politely declined all 3 offers, a decision that had begun to strain her standing in the community. Unmarried women past 25 were viewed with suspicion in Red Creek. They disrupted the natural order of things, raised uncomfortable questions about female independence, and made other women nervous about their own domestic security. The schoolhouse itself stood at the edge of town, a simple wooden structure painted white with green shutters that Eleanor maintained herself. Inside, 23 desks arranged in neat rows faced a blackboard that had seen better days. Eleanor's desk sat at the front, topped with a kerosene lamp, a stack of well-worn primers, and the brass bell. Behind her desk hung a map of the United States, its western territories still colored in optimistic shades of green and gold that bore little resemblance to the brown and sage reality outside her windows. Eleanor's students ranged in age from 6 to 14, children of ranchers, shopkeepers, and working families. She taught reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, and history with the patience of someone who genuinely believed education could transform lives. Many of her students would never travel beyond the next county, but Eleanor made sure they could read a contract, write a letter, and calculate fair wages for their labor. She lived in 2 rooms behind the schoolhouse, a bedroom barely large enough for a narrow bed and washstand, and a sitting room that served as kitchen, parlor, and study. Her possessions were few but carefully chosen. Her mother's Bible with pressed flowers marking favorite verses, a trunk containing her good dress and winter coat, shelves lined with books she had collected since childhood, and a small writing desk where she prepared lessons and wrote letters to her sister in Kansas. Eleanor's sister Margaret wrote regularly, each letter containing variations of the same gentle but persistent question: wouldn't Eleanor be happier returning to civilization where opportunities for marriage might be more abundant? Margaret had married at 19 and now presided over a household in Topeka that included 4 children, a successful husband, and social obligations that filled her days with purposeful activity. She genuinely could not understand why Eleanor would choose isolation over the security of marriage and family. But Eleanor had found something in Red Creek that she hadn't expected to find anywhere, a sense of purpose that went beyond serving someone else's needs. Her students needed her. Parents who could barely write their own names trusted her to prepare their children for a world larger than cattle and drought, and the endless cycle of planting and harvest. She had created something meaningful here, something that belonged to her alone. The morning routine never varied. Eleanor rose before dawn, washed at the basin, dressed in one of her 3 serviceable dresses, and pinned her dark brown hair into the neat bun that parents expected to see. She prepared a simple breakfast, swept the schoolroom, and arranged materials for the day's lessons. At 8 o'clock, she rang the bell. This particular morning in late September had dawned clear and cool, with the first hint of autumn touching the cottonwood trees that lined the creek. Eleanor had planned lessons in arithmetic for the younger children and a discussion of westward expansion for the older ones. She had prepared examples using local references if a rancher needed to move 200 head of cattle from Red Creek to the railhead in Junction City, and the cattle could travel 12 miles per day. How long would the journey take? As Eleanor stepped onto the porch to ring the morning bell, she noticed an unusual number of men gathered outside Murphy's saloon. Even at this early hour, voices carried across the street not the usual low murmur of morning conversation, but something sharper, more animated. She paused, the brass bell silent in her hand. Among the men, she recognized most of the faces. Tom Bradley from the feed store, his red hair unmistakable even at a distance. Joe Martinez, who worked at the livery stable. Frank Weber, whose 3 children attended her school. And towering over all of them, unmistakable even from across the street, stood Wyatt Kane. Wyatt Kane was a man who commanded attention simply by existing. He stood nearly 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block doorways and hands that could span a horse's neck. His dark hair, streaked with premature silver at the temples, was kept short and neat, but his beard grew wild and full, giving him the appearance of a man who had made peace with his own untamed nature. He wore working clothes, denim pants, leather boots, and shirts that strained across his chest, but everything about him was clean and well-maintained. This was not a man who had given up on civilization, merely one who had found his own terms for engaging with it. Stories about Wyatt Kane spread throughout the territory like wildfire across dry grass. Some said he had been a lawman in Texas before coming north. Others claimed he had ridden with cattle drives from Mexico to Montana, earning a reputation for keeping order among men who respected nothing but strength. A few whispered that he had served time in prison, though no one could say for what crime or where. What everyone knew for certain was that Wyatt Kane could end arguments simply by walking into a room. Men who would fight over card games or cattle brands fell silent when he appeared. Not from fear exactly, but from recognition that here was someone who operated on a different level, someone for whom violence was not a threat, but a tool he could use with surgical precision if necessary. Eleanor had seen him in town perhaps a dozen times in 5 years, always at a distance, always surrounded by the kind of respectful space that people maintained around dangerous things. He bought supplies, conducted business, and disappeared back to whatever place he called home. He had never spoken to her, never even acknowledged her existence, which had suited Eleanor perfectly. Now, watching him stand among the gathered men, Eleanor felt an odd prickle of unease. The animated conversation seemed to center around him, and occasionally one of the men would gesture in the direction of the schoolhouse. She rang the bell quickly, 3 sharp peals, and retreated inside to wait for her students. The children arrived as they always did, in clusters and groups, their voices bright with morning energy. Sarah Weber, Frank's eldest daughter, burst through the door with news that her father and several other men were planning something involving the schoolhouse. 10-year-old Billy Martinez reported that his father had been talking with other men about the teacher situation for weeks. Emma Bradley, Tom's daughter, whispered that her mother had been making comments about unmarried women and the influence they might have on impressionable children. Eleanor felt her stomach tighten as she began to understand the shape of what was developing. In small towns, change often came not through reasoned discussion, but through the building pressure of accumulated grievances and social expectations. Someone had decided that her unmarried status had become a problem that required solving, and solutions in Red Creek tended to be direct and final. She conducted the morning lessons with her usual care and attention, but part of her mind remained focused on the street outside, on the conversations happening beyond her control, on the sense that the careful life she had built was about to be tested in ways she had not anticipated. When the noon recess arrived and the children scattered to their homes for dinner, Eleanor remained at her desk, staring at her mother's brass bell and thinking about the choices that had brought her to this moment. She had always known that her independence came at a cost, that small communities demanded conformity in exchange for acceptance. She had believed that her value as a teacher would outweigh the inconvenience of her unmarried state. Perhaps she had been wrong about that. Perhaps Red Creek had decided it was time for Miss Eleanor Price to find her place in the natural order of things, whether she wanted to or not. The confrontation came 3 days later, just as Eleanor was locking the schoolhouse door after the afternoon lessons. She had noticed the men gathering again outside Murphy's saloon, their numbers larger than before, their posture more purposeful. Tom Bradley, Joe Martinez, and Frank Weber had been joined by Chester Hawthorne, Harold Pettigrew, and several ranch hands she didn't recognize by name. Eleanor tried to walk quickly toward her rooms behind the schoolhouse, but Tom Bradley's voice stopped her. "Miss Price, a word, if you please." She turned reluctantly, clutching her lesson book against her chest like a shield. The men had formed a loose semicircle between her and the safety of her door. Their faces wore expressions of determination mixed with embarrassment, the look of men who had been assigned an unpleasant task. "Gentlemen," Eleanor said, keeping her voice steady, "is there something I can help you with regarding the school?" Tom Bradley, clearly appointed as spokesman, cleared his throat. "Well now, Miss Price, it's not exactly about the school. Not directly, anyway." He glanced at the other men for support. "It's more about your situation, your personal situation." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Come now, Miss Price." Chester Hawthorne stepped forward, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had already proposed once and been refused. "You're a sensible woman. You know as well as anyone that your current circumstances aren't natural, aren't healthy for a community like ours. A woman your age," Harold Pettigrew added nervously, "living alone, no family connections, no husband to provide guidance. It raises questions, makes people uncomfortable." Eleanor straightened her shoulders. "My living arrangements are hardly anyone's concern but my own. I fulfill my duties as teacher. I pay my rent. I contribute to this community." "That's just it," Frank Weber interrupted. "You contribute, yes, but what kind of example are you setting for our daughters? What are you teaching them about a woman's proper place? The accusation hit harder than Eleanor had expected. These men were questioning not just her choices, but her competence, her fitness to teach their children. She thought of Sarah Weber's bright face, of Emma Bradley's eager questions, of all the young minds she had nurtured and encouraged. "I teach your daughters to read and write and think for themselves," Eleanor said, her voice rising slightly. "I teach them that education opens doors, that knowledge gives them choices. Choices that lead to spinsterhood and isolation." Chester Hawthorne's tone grew sharper. "Miss Price, you're 26 years old. In 5 more years, you'll be 31, and then what? What happens to this community when we can't find another teacher because word gets out that Red Creek harbors unmarried women past their prime?" The casual cruelty of his words took Eleanor's breath away. She looked from face to face, searching for any sign of sympathy or understanding, but found only the implacable certainty of men who had convinced themselves they were acting for the greater good. "The town council has been discussing your situation," Tom Bradley said, his voice gentler but no less final. "We've decided it's time for you to make a choice. Marriage or departure. Those are your options." Eleanor felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "You can't force me to marry someone I don't love." "Love's a luxury, Miss Price," Harold Pettigrew said. "Security and respectability are necessities. Chester here has made you a fair offer. So have I, for that matter. We're not asking you to choose a stranger." "You're asking me to choose between my independence and my livelihood," Eleanor said. "That's not a choice, it's coercion." The men began moving closer, their circle tightening. Eleanor realized with growing panic that this was not merely a conversation about social expectations. This was an ultimatum backed by physical intimidation. "Now, Miss Price," Joe Martinez said, his voice taking on a tone Eleanor had never heard from him before, "there's no need to make this harder than it has to be. We're reasonable men offering reasonable solutions." "Reasonable?" Eleanor's voice cracked. "You call threatening a woman's career reasonable? We call protecting our community's values reasonable." Chester Hawthorne stepped even closer. "A woman alone, past her prime, filling our daughters' heads with ideas about independence. That's not the kind of influence we want in Red Creek." The circle tightened further. Eleanor could smell whiskey on their breath now, could see the way their eyes had hardened with collective resolve. These were not the same men who had politely tipped their hats to her on the street, who had thanked her for their children's progress in school. These were men who had worked themselves into a righteous fury about a problem they had decided she represented. "Please," Eleanor said, hating the weakness in her voice but unable to stop it. "Just give me time to think." "Time to think of more excuses?" Frank Weber laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Time to come up with more reasons why you're too good for honest men with honest offers?" Eleanor backed against the schoolhouse door, her heart hammering. The lesson book fell from her numb fingers, pages scattering in the afternoon breeze. She looked desperately toward the main street, hoping to see someone, anyone, who might intervene. Instead, she saw Wyatt Kane. He was walking toward them with that deliberate, unhurried pace that somehow covered ground faster than seemed possible. Even at a distance, his presence changed the dynamic of the confrontation. The men sensed him before they saw him, their voices dropping, their postures shifting from aggressive to wary. "Problem here?" Wyatt's voice carried easily across the space between them, though he hadn't raised it above normal conversation level. "No problem, Kane," Tom Bradley said quickly. "Just having a discussion with Miss Price about her future plans." Wyatt continued walking until he stood just outside their circle, close enough that his height and breadth made every other man there look diminished. His dark eyes moved from face to face, cataloguing and assessing before settling on Eleanor. "That's so, Miss Price. You having a friendly discussion about your future plans?" Eleanor looked up at him, up and up, because even standing on the schoolhouse steps, she barely reached his shoulder. His face was unreadable, weathered by sun and wind and experiences she couldn't imagine. But his eyes, when they met hers, held something she hadn't expected to see: patience. He was waiting for her to tell him what she needed. "They want me to marry or leave town," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I see." Wyatt's gaze moved back to the other men. "And which one of you gentlemen is planning to make Miss Price an offer she can't refuse?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that might explode at any moment. Eleanor saw Chester Hawthorne's hand drift toward his gun belt, saw Tom Bradley take a half-step backward, saw the way the ranch hands she didn't know began to spread out slightly, as if preparing for trouble. "This isn't your concern, Kane," Frank Weber said, trying to inject authority into his voice. "This is a community matter. Seems to me any matter involving a lady being cornered by a group of men becomes everyone's concern," Wyatt replied. His voice remained conversational, almost pleasant, but something in his tone made Harold Pettigrew visibly swallow. Eleanor felt terror and desperation war in her chest. Here was the most dangerous man in 3 counties, facing down a group of armed men on her behalf, and she had no idea why. In her panic, words came tumbling out before she could stop them. "Don't hurt me," she said, looking up at Wyatt's imposing figure. "I'll give you sons." The silence that followed was complete. Even the wind seemed to pause, waiting to see what would happen next. Eleanor immediately wanted to take the words back, to explain that fear had made her speak without thinking, that she hadn't meant to offer herself like cattle at auction. But the damage was done. Every man present had heard her desperate bargain, had witnessed her terror and submission. Wyatt looked down at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he placed one large, gentle hand on her shoulder. "She's under my protection now," he said quietly. The words carried absolute finality. Not a threat, not a challenge, simply a statement of fact that reorganized the entire situation in an instant. Tom Bradley was the first to speak. "Now hold on, Kane. We were here first. We have legitimate." "You have nothing," Wyatt cut him off. "The lady has made her choice." "That's not how this works," Chester Hawthorne protested. "You can't just claim her like a stray calf." Wyatt's head turned toward Chester with mechanical precision. "You comparing Miss Price to livestock, Hawthorne?" The question dropped Chester's protest mid-sentence. Around the circle, hands moved away from gun belts as men realized they were in the presence of someone whose capacity for violence far exceeded their own. "Didn't think so," Wyatt said. He looked back at Eleanor, his voice gentling. "You go on inside now, Miss Price. Lock your door. This conversation is finished." Eleanor stumbled toward her door, her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn the key. Behind her, she heard the murmur of voices as the men dispersed, their grand plans for solving the teacher problem thoroughly derailed by Wyatt Kane's intervention. She made it inside and leaned against the closed door, her heart still racing. Through the window, she could see Wyatt standing in the street, watching until the last of the men had disappeared. Only then did he turn and walk away, leaving Eleanor alone with the shocking realization that her life had just changed completely. She was under Wyatt Kane's protection now. Whatever that meant, whatever price it would require, she was no longer the unmarried schoolteacher, fighting alone against the town's expectations. She was something else entirely, and she had no idea what that something was. Eleanor spent the night pacing her small rooms, replaying every moment of the confrontation and wondering what she had committed herself to. The words, "I'll give you sons," echoed in her mind like a curse she couldn't take back. What had possessed her to say such a thing? What kind of arrangement had she agreed to with a man she knew only by reputation? She rose before dawn, as was her habit. But when she stepped onto the schoolhouse porch to ring the morning bell, she found that someone had been there before her. The damaged roof beam that had been sagging for months, the one she had been saving money to repair, had been replaced with solid, new timber. Fresh wood shavings scattered around the base of the porch told the story of careful, skillful work done in darkness. Eleanor stared at the repair in bewilderment. She had mentioned the beam to no one except the town council when she had requested funds for maintenance. They had told her to make do until the next budget allocation. Now here it was, fixed overnight by invisible hands. The morning bell brought her students as usual, but Eleanor noticed differences in their behavior. Sarah Weber kept glancing toward the windows, as if expecting to see something unusual. Billy Martinez whispered urgently with the older boys during their arithmetic lesson. Emma Bradley seemed subdued, her usual bright questions replaced by careful silence. It was young Timothy Carson, the blacksmith's son, who finally spoke what the others were thinking. "Miss Price," he said during the noon recess, "my pa says you're gonna marry Wyatt Kane." Eleanor felt her cheeks burn. "Your pa shouldn't be discussing such things with children, Timothy." "But are you?" Sarah Weber pressed. "Billy Martinez says his father told him you made some kind of deal with Mr. Kane yesterday." Eleanor looked out at her students, children she had taught to think for themselves, to ask questions, to seek truth. They deserved honesty, even if she wasn't entirely sure what the truth was. "I don't know what's going to happen," she said carefully. "Mr. Kane helped me yesterday when I was in trouble. Beyond that, I can't say." "My ma says it's about time someone took you in hand," Emma Bradley said, then immediately looked stricken, as if she hadn't meant to repeat her mother's words. Eleanor felt a familiar stab of hurt at the casual cruelty that seemed to follow discussions of her unmarried state. But before she could respond, Timothy Carson stood up straighter. "My pa says Mr. Kane don't do nothing without good reason," he declared. "If he's looking after Miss Price, it's 'cause she needs looking after, and anyone who don't like it can take it up with him." The simple loyalty in the boy's voice brought unexpected tears to Eleanor's eyes. At least some of the community understood the difference between protection and possession. That afternoon, as Eleanor dismissed her students and began tidying the classroom, she heard the distinctive sound of a horse approaching at an easy walk. Through the window, she saw Wyatt Kane dismounting from a large bay gelding, moving with the fluid grace of a man completely comfortable in his own body. Eleanor's mouth went dry. This was their first meeting since yesterday's confrontation, their first chance to speak privately about what had happened and what it meant. She smoothed her skirts, checked her hair, and reminded herself that she was an educated woman, capable of rational conversation. Wyatt knocked on the schoolhouse door with surprising gentleness, 3 soft raps that barely carried through the wood. Eleanor opened it to find him standing with his hat in his hands, looking for all the world, like a parent come to discuss his child's progress. "Miss Price," he said, inclining his head politely, "might I have a word?" "Of course." Eleanor stepped aside to let him enter, immediately regretting the invitation when his presence filled the small classroom completely. He had to duck slightly to avoid the hanging lamp, and his shoulders seemed to span the entire space between the desks. Wyatt looked around the schoolroom with obvious interest, taking in the carefully arranged books, the neat rows of desks, the map on the wall. His gaze lingered on the brass bell sitting on Eleanor's desk. "Your mother's?" he asked. Eleanor started. How did you know? Seen bells like that before. Wagons coming west in the 70s carried them for calling families together when they made camp." He looked at her directly. "Your folks came out on a train?" "In 1864, Eleanor said, surprised by his perceptiveness. "My father was looking for farmland in Colorado, but my mother died on the trail. Cholera. He settled here instead. Said he was too tired to go any farther." Wyatt nodded as if this explained something important. "And he raised you alone?" "Until I was 16. Then he died too, and I went to live with my sister in Kansas. She arranged for my education at the teaching college." Eleanor found herself talking more freely than she had intended. Something about Wyatt's quiet attention invited confidence. "But you came back west." "I wanted to teach somewhere that needed teachers," Eleanor said. "Eastern schools have plenty of qualified candidates. Out here, I could make a real difference." "And you have," Wyatt said simply. "Tommy Carson reads better than his father now. Sarah Weber can figure sums faster than Frank. You've given these children something they wouldn't have had otherwise." Eleanor stared at him. "You know my students?" "I know most folks in Red Creek, one way or another." Wyatt turned his hat in his hands, studying it as if looking for the right words. Miss Price, about yesterday, Mr. Kane, I need to apologize. Eleanor interrupted. What I said about giving you sons, I was terrified and not thinking clearly. I didn't mean to imply that I was offering myself as payment for your protection. Wyatt looked up from his hat, his dark eyes serious. I know you didn't. You do? A woman who meant what you said wouldn't have apologized for it. He set his hat on one of the student desks. Miss Price, I need you to understand something. What happened yesterday, what I told those men, it wasn't about claiming you or making some kind of bargain. It was about stopping them from doing something they'd all regret later. Eleanor felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. Then you don't expect, that is, you're not planning to, I'm not planning to force anything on you, Wyatt said firmly. But I meant what I said about protection. Those men won't bother you again, not directly, but they'll find other ways to pressure you if they can. What kind of ways? Wyatt was quiet for a moment, considering his words. They could complain to the Territorial Education Board about your moral character. They could cut funding for the school. They could make life difficult for families who support you. He met her eyes. Small towns have long memories and creative ways of getting what they want. Eleanor sank into her desk chair, the weight of her situation settling over her like a heavy blanket. So, what you're saying is that your protection comes with a price. After all, just not the price I was afraid of. The price is that people will assume we have an understanding, Wyatt said. They'll expect us to behave like a courting couple. They'll watch for signs that we're planning a future together. And if we don't provide those signs, then they'll decide I'm not serious about you, and the pressure will start again, probably worse than before. Eleanor looked out the window at the town she had called home for 5 years, feeling as if she was seeing it clearly for the first time. Every building, every street, every face represented judgment and expectation, and the relentless pressure to conform. So my choices are to pretend to court you or leave Red Creek entirely, she said. Those are your practical choices, yes. Eleanor turned back to him, studying his weathered face for any sign of what he wanted from this arrangement. What do you get out of it, Mr. Kane? Why would you put yourself in this position for someone you barely know? Wyatt picked up his hat, turning it slowly in his large hands. Maybe I think Red Creek needs a good teacher more than it needs another man's wife. The simple statement hit Eleanor with unexpected force. He wasn't trying to rescue her from spinsterhood or reform her independent ways. He was trying to preserve her ability to do the work she loved. There's something else you should know, Wyatt continued. I fixed your roof beam this morning. I'll be doing other repairs around the schoolhouse as needed. People will see me here regularly, working on maintenance projects. You don't have to. Yes, I do, Wyatt said quietly. If we're going to convince people we have an understanding, I need to act like a man who's invested in your welfare, and this building needs proper care if it's going to keep serving the children. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the thoughtfulness of it. He was giving her a way to accept his help without compromising her dignity, framing necessary repairs as part of their pretense rather than charity. Mr. Kane, she said softly, I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me yet, he replied, settling his hat back on his head. Wait and see if this arrangement works out the way we hope it will. He moved toward the door, then paused. Miss Price, there's one more thing. If anyone asks about our understanding, let me do the talking. I've had more practice dealing with difficult situations. Eleanor nodded, though she wasn't sure she understood what he meant. And Miss Price? Wyatt looked back at her one more time. That was quick thinking yesterday. What you said might not have been the words you meant to choose, but they solved the immediate problem. Sometimes that's all we can do, solve the problem right in front of us and worry about the consequences later. After he left, Eleanor sat in her empty classroom for a long time, thinking about consequences and choices and the strange turn her life had taken. Outside, she could hear the sounds of Red Creek settling into evening, children being called home for supper, horses being led to barns, the distant sound of voices from Murphy's saloon. For the first time in days, those sounds didn't fill her with anxiety. Whatever this arrangement with Wyatt Kane turned out to be, it had bought her time and space to breathe. It had given her a chance to keep teaching, to keep the life she had built for herself. That had to be worth something. The question was, what would it cost her in the end? The lesson plan book that Eleanor kept on her desk had belonged to her predecessor, the whiskey-fond schoolmaster, whose sudden departure had created her opportunity in Red Creek. She had spent hours studying his notes during her first months, learning which children struggled with reading, which ones had a gift for numbers, which families valued education, and which saw school as an unwelcome interruption to farm work. Over 5 years, she had filled 3 more books with her own observations, tracking each student's progress with the dedication of a scientist recording important discoveries. Sarah Weber had overcome a severe stutter through patient pronunciation exercises. Billy Martinez had learned to love geography by connecting it to stories his grandfather told about Mexico. Timothy Carson had discovered a talent for writing that surprised everyone, including himself. Eleanor was updating her notes on the younger children's arithmetic progress when she heard familiar footsteps on the schoolhouse porch. 3 days had passed since her conversation with Wyatt, and she had begun to wonder if their arrangement was more theoretical than practical. His appearance each afternoon suggested otherwise. "Miss Price," Wyatt called through the open door. "Mind if I take a look at those window frames? Noticed some gaps that might let in cold air come winter." "Of course," Eleanor replied, though she suspected the windows were fine. This was the 3rd repair project he had found in as many days, each one providing a reasonable excuse for his presence at the schoolhouse. Wyatt worked with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to solving problems with his hands. He examined each window frame carefully, making notes in a small book he carried, occasionally testing the fit of sashes or checking the condition of glass panes. His movements were deliberate and thorough, the work of someone who understood that proper maintenance prevented larger problems later. "Mr. Kane," Eleanor said, setting down her pen, "might I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "How is it that you know so much about my students? Yesterday, you mentioned Timothy's reading and Sarah's arithmetic, but I've never seen you at any school events." Wyatt paused in his examination of the north-facing window. "People talk. Parents mention their children's progress when they're pleased with it. Shopkeepers notice when kids can make change properly or read signs without help." He glanced at her. "Word gets around about a teacher who cares about her work." Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest at the indirect compliment. "The families here have been very supportive. Most of them, anyway." "Most of them appreciate what you've done for their children," Wyatt agreed. "The ones causing trouble aren't thinking about education. They're thinking about control." "Control?" Wyatt moved to the next window, testing its frame with gentle pressure. Small communities run on certain understandings about how things should work. Everyone has a place. Everyone knows their role. When someone steps outside those boundaries, it makes other people nervous. "Because it suggests the boundaries might not be as fixed as they believed," Eleanor said, understanding dawning. "Exactly." Wyatt looked at her with something that might have been approval. "You teaching their daughters that women can be independent, can support themselves, can choose their own paths that challenges some fundamental assumptions about how the world works." Eleanor thought about her female students, bright girls like Sarah Weber and Emma Bradley, who absorbed lessons with the same enthusiasm as their male classmates. "Do you think I'm wrong to encourage them? I think you're giving them tools they'll need," Wyatt said simply. "World's changing faster than most folks realize. Women who can read and write and think for themselves will be better prepared for whatever comes next." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of visitors Frank Weber and his wife Martha, approaching the schoolhouse with purposeful strides. Eleanor felt her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety, but Wyatt continued working on the windows as if their arrival was of no particular concern. "Miss Price," Frank called out, "Mrs. Weber and I would like a word." Eleanor stepped onto the porch, very aware of Wyatt's presence just inside the doorway. "Good afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. Weber," Is this about Sarah's progress? She's doing very well with her geography lessons. Martha Webber was a thin, sharp-featured woman who had never quite approved of having an unmarried teacher for her daughter. It's not about Sarah's schoolwork, she said crisply. It's about the example being set for her. I'm not sure I understand. Frank Webber glanced toward the schoolhouse, where the sounds of Wyatt's work were clearly audible. We understand that you and Mr. Kane have reached some kind of arrangement. We're concerned about the propriety of it, Martha added. A single woman and a single man spending time alone together. Without proper supervision, it's not the kind of behavior we want our daughter to think is acceptable. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. The accusation was particularly galling because it ignored the very real constraints that governed her interactions with Wyatt. They were never truly alone. Their conversations took place in the schoolhouse during daylight hours, with the door open and anyone free to observe. Mr. Kane has been kind enough to help with necessary repairs to the school building, Eleanor said carefully. I hardly think that constitutes improper behavior. Perhaps not, Frank Webber said, but it raises questions about your judgment, about whether you understand the importance of maintaining proper appearances. From inside the schoolhouse came the sound of a window sash being tested, then Wyatt's voice, pitched to carry clearly. Afternoon, Frank, Mrs. Webber. He appeared in the doorway, filling the frame completely. Something I can help you folks with? Frank Webber's confident tone wavered slightly. Just discussing school matters with Miss Price. School matters, Wyatt repeated thoughtfully. That would be things like curriculum, teaching methods, student progress, that sort of thing? Well, yes, but also because if you're discussing Miss Price's personal conduct, that seems more like personal matters than school matters. Wyatt's voice remained conversational, but something in his tone made Frank Webber take a half-step backward. Martha Webber was made of sterner stuff. Mr. Kane, surely you understand that as parents, we have a responsibility to ensure our daughter isn't exposed to inappropriate influences. What kind of inappropriate influences? Wyatt asked. The influence of a woman who disregards proper social conventions, Martha said, lifting her chin defiantly. A woman who accepts male companionship without the benefit of engagement or marriage. Eleanor opened her mouth to defend herself, but Wyatt spoke first. Mrs. Webber, are you suggesting that Miss Price is behaving improperly? I'm suggesting that appearances matter, Martha replied. That young girls need to see examples of modest, appropriate female behavior. Wyatt was quiet for a moment, considering this. Then he stepped fully onto the porch, his height and presence transforming the dynamic of the conversation. Mrs. Webber, he said quietly, Miss Price spends her days teaching your daughter to read, write, and calculate. She prepares lessons in her own time, buys supplies with her own money, and treats every child in her care with patience and respect. If that's not an example of appropriate female behavior, I'm not sure what would be. Martha Webber's face flushed red, but she pressed on. That's not the point. It's exactly the point, Wyatt cut her off gently. You're concerned about influences on your daughter. Well, Miss Price influences Sarah to work hard, think clearly, and value education. Seems to me those are good influences. Frank Webber cleared his throat nervously. Now, Kane, we're not criticizing Miss Price's teaching. Then, what are you criticizing? Wyatt's question hung in the air like a challenge. The Webbers exchanged glances, clearly realizing they had wandered into territory more dangerous than they had anticipated. Their concern about propriety was running headlong into Wyatt Kane's protection, and the confrontation was not going as they had planned. We just think, Martha said finally, that if you and Miss Price have an understanding, it should be formalized properly. An engagement announcement, perhaps. Clear intentions stated publicly. Eleanor felt her heart skip. This was the trap she had been dreading, the moment when their pretense would be exposed, or they would be forced to make it real. But Wyatt seemed unperturbed. Mrs. Webber, when Miss Price and I decide to make any announcements about our future, we'll do so in our own time and in our own way. Until then, I'd appreciate folks respecting our privacy." The careful phrasing was masterful, Eleanor realized. He had neither confirmed nor denied an engagement, but had spoken as if their relationship was a settled matter that simply hadn't been announced yet. He had given the Webbers what they wanted to hear without actually committing to anything specific. "Of course," Frank Webber said quickly. "We didn't mean to pry, just wanted to make sure everything was, well, proper. Everything is exactly as proper as it needs to be," Wyatt replied. "Miss Price is a lady deserving of respect, and she'll receive it from everyone in this community. I'm sure you agree." It wasn't really a question, and the Webbers both nodded hastily. After they left, Eleanor and Wyatt stood on the porch in silence, watching the couple hurry back toward town. Eleanor felt drained by the encounter, exhausted by the constant need to defend her choices and justify her existence. "How many more conversations like that do you think we'll have?" she asked. "Fewer and fewer," Wyatt said. "Word will get around that we're serious about each other. Once people believe that, they'll stop questioning the propriety of our association." Eleanor looked at him curiously. "You're very good at managing these situations, almost like you've had practice." Wyatt was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I've learned that most problems between people come from misunderstandings. Clear communication prevents a lot of trouble. Is that what we're doing? Communicating clearly?" "We're letting people reach the conclusions they need to reach," Wyatt said. "Sometimes that's the same thing." Eleanor thought about this as she watched him gather his tools and prepare to leave. Their arrangement was working, but it was also becoming more complex with each passing day. The line between pretense and reality was blurring in ways that made her uneasy. What would happen when the community's expectations finally required more than careful words and implied understandings? What would they do when Red Creek demanded proof that their relationship was more than an elaborate performance? Eleanor was beginning to suspect that question would answer itself sooner than either of them might be ready for. The hand-carved wooden rose sat on Eleanor's desk like a small miracle, its petals so delicately rendered that she found herself touching it throughout the day to convince herself it was real. Wyatt had left it there sometime during the night, along with a brief note. "Thought you might like something pretty for your desk. W.K." Eleanor had discovered it when she arrived for the morning lessons, nestled beside her lesson plan book where she couldn't miss it. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each petal carved with precise detail, the stem complete with thorns and leaves, the whole piece sanded smooth and finished with what looked like beeswax to bring out the warm tones of the wood. She had never owned anything so beautiful, certainly nothing created specifically for her by someone who had taken such obvious care with the work. The rose represented hours of careful attention, skill accumulated over years, and most surprising of all, the desire to give her something that served no practical purpose, except to bring her joy. "That's real pretty, Miss Price," Sarah Webber said during the morning recess, touching the wooden rose with gentle fingers. "Where'd you get it?" Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. "It was a gift." "From Mr. Kane?" Emma Bradley asked, with the directness of childhood. "Yes, from Mr. Kane." The girls exchanged meaningful glances that made Eleanor realize how closely the children were watching her relationship with Wyatt. To them, it was a romance unfolding before their eyes, complete with tokens of affection and the kind of grown-up drama they were only beginning to understand. "My ma says when a man gives a woman presents like that, it means he's serious about her," Sarah said importantly. "Your ma says a lot of things," Eleanor replied, but gently. "Perhaps we should focus on our geography lesson." The afternoon brought Wyatt himself, arriving with lumber and tools to replace several loose floorboards near the back of the classroom. Eleanor tried to continue with her lesson planning while he worked, but found herself distracted by the steady rhythm of his movements, the quiet competence with which he approached each task. "Mr. Kane," she said during a pause in his hammering, "the rose is beautiful." "Thank you." Wyatt looked up from his work, wood shavings caught in his dark hair. "Glad you like it. Figured you could use something cheerful in here. Did you carve it yourself? I did. He returned to his work, driving nails with precise strikes. Used to do a lot of woodworking, helps pass the time. Eleanor wanted to ask more where he had learned such skill, what other pieces he had made, whether carving was something he enjoyed or merely a practical necessity. But Wyatt's answers tended toward the minimal, and she had learned not to press for details he wasn't ready to share. The comfortable rhythm of their afternoon was interrupted by the arrival of Chester Hawthorne, who approached the schoolhouse with the determined stride of a man on an unpleasant mission. Eleanor felt her stomach clench with familiar anxiety, but Wyatt continued working as if Chester's presence was of no particular concern. "Miss Price," Chester called from the doorway, "might I have a word?" Eleanor glanced at Wyatt, who had paused in his hammering but remained crouched beside the floorboards. "Of course, Mr. Hawthorne. Please come in." Chester stepped into the classroom, his eyes moving immediately to the wooden rows on Eleanor's desk, then to Wyatt's tools scattered across the floor. "I see Kane's been keeping himself busy around here." "Mr. Kane has been kind enough to help with necessary repairs," Eleanor said carefully. "How generous of him." Chester's tone carried an edge of sarcasm. "I suppose it's easier than hiring proper workmen." Wyatt stood slowly, his full height making the classroom seem suddenly smaller. "Something on your mind, Hawthorne?" Chester squared his shoulders, clearly steeling himself for confrontation. "As a matter of fact, there is. I've been thinking about our conversation last week, Miss Price, about my proposal." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "Mr. Hawthorne, I thought I made my position clear." "You made your panic clear," Chester interrupted. "But panic makes people say things they don't mean, make choices they wouldn't normally consider." His gaze flicked toward Wyatt. "I'm wondering if you've had time to reconsider more rational options." The insult was barely veiled. Chester was suggesting that her association with Wyatt was irrational, that his own proposal represented the sensible choice she should have made if fear hadn't clouded her judgment. "Miss Price's choices seem perfectly rational to me," Wyatt said quietly. Chester turned to face him fully. "Do they? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like she's traded one set of problems for another. At least my offer came with legal protection and social respectability. Your offer came with 5 children who needed a mother and a house that needed a keeper," Wyatt replied. "That's not the same thing as what Miss Price deserves." "And what does she deserve, in your opinion?" Eleanor watched the exchange with growing alarm. The two men were circling each other like predators, their words increasingly sharp despite the civilized tone. She could feel the situation escalating toward something dangerous. "She deserves to be valued for who she is, not what she can provide," Wyatt said. Chester laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's a pretty sentiment, Kane, but it doesn't pay bills or provide security. Miss Price isn't getting any younger. In a few years, she'll be past 30 and facing a very different set of choices. You seem awfully concerned about Miss Price's future for someone who barely knows her," Wyatt observed. "I know her well enough to see that she's a practical woman who's made an impractical decision." Chester's voice was rising slightly. "I'm offering her marriage, Kane. Legal marriage with a home and children and a place in this community. What exactly are you offering?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dangerous fire. Eleanor realized that Chester was forcing them to define their relationship publicly, to move beyond carefully worded implications to specific commitments. Wyatt was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on Chester's face. When he spoke, his voice was calm and certain. "I'm offering her my protection, my respect, and my commitment to her welfare. That's more than most marriages provide." "But is it marriage?" Chester pressed. "Because if it's not, then Miss Price is still available to consider other offers. Better offers." Eleanor found her voice at last. "Mr. Hawthorne, I appreciate your concern, but my relationship with Mr. Kane is not your business to evaluate or judge." "Isn't it?" Chester turned to her with something like pity in his eyes. "Miss Price, I'm trying to save you from a mistake that will haunt you for the rest of your life." Kane here is playing games with you, stringing you along with pretty words and wooden trinkets while you waste what little time you have left to make a proper match. The casual cruelty of his assessment hit Eleanor like a physical blow. He was reducing her worth to her marriageability, measuring her value by her youth and childbearing potential, dismissing her relationship with Wyatt as a frivolous distraction from serious business. "That's enough," Wyatt said, his voice dropping to a level that made Chester take an involuntary step backward. "Is it?" Chester rallied, recognizing that retreat would mean defeat. "Because I don't see a ring on her finger, Kane. I don't see any formal announcement of engagement. All I see is a woman being led on by a man who's too selfish to either commit to her or let her go." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the accuracy of Chester's observation. He was right about the ambiguity of her situation, right about the lack of formal commitment, right about the uncertainty that plagued her relationship with Wyatt. But he was wrong about Wyatt's motivations. "Mr. Hawthorne," Eleanor said, her voice stronger than she felt, "you're mistaken about several things. First, Mr. Kane is not leading me on. We both understand the nature of our relationship perfectly well. Second, I am not looking for rescue from someone who views marriage as a practical arrangement rather than a partnership. And third, my value as a woman is not determined by my age or my marital status." Chester's face flushed red. "Miss Price, you're being naive. She's being clear," Wyatt interrupted. "And you're being disrespectful. I think it's time for you to leave." Chester looked from Eleanor to Wyatt, clearly recognizing that he had overplayed his hand. His attempt to drive a wedge between them had instead forced them to defend each other, strengthening the very bond he had hoped to break. "This isn't over," he said finally. "Miss Price, when you come to your senses, my offer still stands, for now." After he left, Eleanor and Wyatt stood in the classroom's silence, the weight of what had just happened settling between them. Chester had forced them to articulate things they had been content to leave unspoken, had pushed them to define a relationship that had been deliberately undefined. "I'm sorry about that," Eleanor said finally. "He had no right to speak to you that way." "He had no right to speak to you that way," Wyatt replied. "The man's a fool if he thinks bullying will win him a wife." Eleanor touched the wooden rose on her desk, drawing comfort from its smooth surface. "He's not entirely wrong, though, about the ambiguity of our situation. People are going to keep asking questions until they get clearer answers." Wyatt resumed his work on the floorboards, but Eleanor could see tension in the set of his shoulders. "What kind of answers do you want to give them?" It was a fair question, and Eleanor realized she didn't have a ready answer. Their arrangement had begun as a practical solution to an immediate problem, but it was evolving into something more complex. She was beginning to care about Wyatt's good opinion, to look forward to his daily visits, to feel genuine affection for the man who had appointed himself her protector. But did that mean she was ready for marriage? Ready to exchange her independence for the security Chester Hawthorne kept insisting she needed? "I don't know," Eleanor said honestly. "I know I'm grateful for your protection. I know I enjoy your company. I know I trust you in ways I've never trusted anyone else." Wyatt looked up from his work. "But?" Eleanor met his eyes, seeing patience and something else, something that might have been hope. "But I'm scared of what happens if this becomes real. If it stops being an arrangement and becomes something genuine." "Why does that scare you?" Eleanor thought about all the ways caring about someone could go wrong, all the ways love could become loss, all the ways happiness could be taken away without warning. "Because I've built a life for myself here, a life that belongs to me. If I give that up for marriage, for someone else's idea of what my life should be, what happens if it doesn't work out? What happens if I lose myself in trying to be what someone else needs?" Wyatt was quiet for a long time, considering her words. Finally, he set down his hammer and looked at her directly. "Miss Price," he said softly, "the right person wouldn't ask you to give up who you are. The right person would want to build something with you, not replace what you've already built." The simple statement hit Eleanor with unexpected force. She had never considered that marriage might be additive rather than substitutional, that the right partnership might enhance her life rather than restrict it. "Is that what you want?" she asked. "To build something together?" Wyatt's answer came without hesitation. Yes. The single word carried weight and certainty and the promise of possibilities Eleanor had never allowed herself to imagine. For the first time since their arrangement began, she began to wonder if it might become something real, something chosen rather than accepted, something desired rather than merely necessary. The question was whether she was brave enough to find out. Eleanor's teaching certificate hung in a simple frame above her desk, the formal script proclaiming her qualification to educate children in the territories. She had earned it through 2 years of rigorous study, comprehensive examinations, and practical teaching experience under the supervision of master educators. It represented her independence, her professional identity, and her right to support herself through work she found meaningful. Now, 3 weeks after Chester Hawthorne's confrontation, that certificate had become the center of a heated debate within the Red Creek Town Council. Eleanor learned about the debate from an unexpected source, young Timothy Carson, whose father attended council meetings as the elected representative of the town's skilled tradesmen. "Miss Price," Timothy said after the other children had been dismissed for the day, "my pa says there's going to be trouble at tonight's meeting. About you and the school." Eleanor felt her stomach clench with familiar dread. "What kind of trouble, Timothy?" "Some folks are saying you ain't fit to teach anymore, on account of your moral character." The boy's face was flushed with embarrassment at having to repeat such words. "Pa says it's nonsense, but he thought you should know what's coming." Eleanor sank into her desk chair, the weight of her situation pressing down like a physical burden. She had hoped that her arrangement with Wyatt would provide enough social cover to protect her position, but apparently some members of the community remained unconvinced. "Timothy," she said carefully, "did your father say who was leading this complaint?" "Mr. Hawthorne, mostly, but he's got Mr. Bradley and Mr. Pettigrew backing him up. They're saying a woman of questionable reputation shouldn't be influencing children." Timothy's young face darkened with anger. "Pa says they're just mad because you won't marry none of them." The boy's assessment was probably accurate, but that didn't make the threat any less real. If the town council decided to terminate her contract, Eleanor would lose not just her position but her home, her income, and her reason for staying in Red Creek. As if summoned by her thoughts, Wyatt appeared in the schoolhouse doorway. He took one look at her face and immediately stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "What's happened?" he asked without preamble. Eleanor explained Timothy's warning, while Wyatt listened with the focused attention she had come to associate with him, processing a potentially dangerous situation. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on something beyond the windows. "They're forcing a crisis," he said finally, "pushing for a resolution they can control." "What do you mean?" "They want you to choose between your job and your reputation. If you fight to keep your position, they'll paint you as a woman of loose morals, corrupting innocent children. If you resign quietly, they'll say it proves their accusations were justified." Eleanor felt trapped between equally unacceptable alternatives. "So what do I do?" "We attend the meeting," Wyatt said simply, "together, and we make it clear that their accusations are unfounded." "How?" Wyatt was quiet for another long moment, his expression thoughtful. "By announcing our engagement." The words hit Eleanor like cold water. They had danced around the possibility of making their arrangement real, but always in theoretical terms, always with the safety of imprecision. Now, Wyatt was suggesting they cross that line publicly and irrevocably. "Wyatt," she said softly, "is that what you want? A real engagement, not just a pretense?" He looked at her directly, his gaze steady and serious. "I want you to keep your job. I want you to stay in Red Creek. I want those children to continue benefiting from your teaching." He paused. "And I want the chance to court you properly, without the cloud of scandal hanging over both of us." "Court me properly?" Eleanor felt her heart skip at the unexpected phrase. "The way you deserve to be courted," Wyatt said, "with patience and respect and the understanding that you're choosing to be with me, not accepting me as the least problematic option." Eleanor stood and walked to the window, looking out at the town that had become her home, despite its flaws and limitations. She thought about her students, about the life she had built here, about the precarious balance between independence and security that had defined her existence for 5 years. She thought about Wyatt, his quiet strength, his unexpected gentleness, the way he had consistently defended her choices rather than trying to change them. She thought about his wooden rose sitting on her desk, about the careful repairs he had made to her schoolhouse, about the patient way he answered her questions without demanding answers to his own. "If we announce an engagement," she said slowly, "it would have to be real. I won't lie to the community about something so important. I wouldn't ask you to." Eleanor turned back to face him. "And if we become engaged, truly engaged, you understand that I'm not ready to set a wedding date immediately, that I need time to be certain about such a momentous decision." "I understand. And you understand that I want to continue teaching after we marry, that I'm not looking for a husband who expects me to give up work I love?" Wyatt's expression softened slightly. "Miss Price, I've watched you teach for weeks now. I've seen how much your students mean to you and how much you mean to them. I'd never ask you to give up something that brings you such fulfillment." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the simple acceptance in his voice. No conditions, no negotiations, no expectation that marriage would transform her into someone different. "Eleanor," she said quietly. "What?" "If we're going to be engaged, you should call me Eleanor." Wyatt smiled, the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him. It transformed his weathered face completely, revealing warmth and humor that he usually kept carefully hidden. "Eleanor," he said, testing the name. "I like that." The town council meeting took place in the church hall, the only building in Red Creek large enough to accommodate the crowd that had gathered. Eleanor arrived with Wyatt just before the meeting was called to order, their entrance together causing a ripple of whispers and speculation throughout the assembled townspeople. Chairman Morrison, the Reverend's father, and a man generally disposed toward fairness, called for order and outlined the evening's agenda. Eleanor's contract renewal was listed as the final item, which meant they would have to sit through an hour of routine business before their fate was decided. Eleanor tried to follow the discussions about road maintenance and tax assessments, but her attention kept drifting to the faces around them. Some showed support. Timothy Carson's father nodded encouragingly when their eyes met, and several parents of her students offered reassuring smiles. But others displayed the stern disapproval of people who had already made up their minds about her unsuitability. When Chairman Morrison finally called for discussion of Eleanor's contract, Chester Hawthorne was on his feet before the words were fully spoken. "Mr. Chairman," Chester said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, "I believe this community faces a serious question about the moral standards we expect from those who educate our children." Eleanor felt Wyatt tense beside her, but he remained seated as Chester outlined his concerns about her irregular situation and questionable associations. The accusations were carefully worded to avoid outright slander, while still painting a picture of a woman whose behavior fell short of community standards. Tom Bradley rose to second Chester's concerns, followed by Harold Pettigrew with additional comments about the importance of proper role models for impressionable young people. Their speeches were measured and reasonable sounding, the kind of arguments that could sway undecided listeners. Then Frank Weber stood up. "Mr. Chairman," Frank said, his voice slightly hesitant, "I'd like to speak in support of Miss Price." Eleanor felt her heart lift with surprise and gratitude. "My daughter Sarah has been Miss Price's student for 3 years," Frank continued. "In that time, I've watched her transform, from a child who struggled with reading to one who devours every book she can find. Miss Price didn't just teach her letters and numbers. She taught her to believe in her own intelligence, to ask questions, to think for herself." Frank paused, glancing around the room. Now, I've heard some talk about Miss Price's personal situation, about her being unmarried and the concerns that raises. But I've never seen any evidence that her marital status affects her ability to teach children. What I have seen is a dedicated educator who cares deeply about every student in her charge. Other parents began to stand, adding their voices to Frank's. Mary Carson spoke about Timothy's newfound love of learning. Miguel Martinez praised Eleanor's patience with children who spoke Spanish at home. One by one, the parents of Eleanor's students rose to defend her competence and character. Chester Hawthorne grew visibly frustrated as the tide of opinion shifted against him. "Mr. Chairman," he said, his voice rising, "we're not questioning Miss Price's teaching abilities. We're questioning the example she sets by living in an irregular arrangement with a man to whom she's not married." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Eleanor felt every eye in the room turned toward her, and Wyatt, waiting to see how they would respond. Wyatt stood slowly, his height and presence commanding immediate attention. "Mr. Chairman," he said, his voice calm and clear, "I'd like to address Mr. Hawthorne's concerns directly." "The floor recognizes Wyatt Kane," Chairman Morrison said. Wyatt reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Eleanor's breath caught as he turned to face her, dropping to one knee beside her chair. "Eleanor Price," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall, "will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The church hall fell completely silent. Eleanor looked down at Wyatt's upturned face, seeing hope and determination and something deeper, genuine affection that had grown slowly and steadily over the weeks of their arrangement. She thought about all the reasons to say no, all the logical arguments against rushing into an engagement to solve a political problem. Then she thought about all the reasons to say yes, not just the practical ones, but the emotional ones she had been afraid to acknowledge. "Yes," she said simply. Wyatt slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, not an elaborate engagement ring, but a wedding band that spoke of permanence and commitment. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, the controversy forgotten in the face of romance finally realized. Chester Hawthorne remained standing, his face flushed with anger and defeat. "This proves nothing," he said loudly. "A convenient engagement doesn't erase months of improper conduct." The applause died away as people turned to stare at Chester with varying degrees of disapproval. Even his supporters seemed embarrassed by his inability to accept graceful defeat. Chairman Morrison stood up, his expression stern. "Mr. Hawthorne, I think this community has heard enough accusations for one evening. Miss Price has just announced her engagement to a respected member of our community. Her moral character is no longer a matter for public debate. Furthermore," the chairman continued, "I believe this council should vote immediately on Miss Price's contract renewal. All in favor?" The vote was overwhelming, every hand in the room raised, except for Chester Hawthorne's and his two allies. Eleanor's position was secure, her reputation restored, her future in Red Creek guaranteed. As the meeting dissolved into congratulatory chaos, Eleanor sat in her chair, looking down at the wedding band on her finger. It felt strange, and right at the same time, a symbol of a commitment that had grown from necessity into something approaching genuine feeling. Wyatt leaned down to speak quietly in her ear. "No going back now," he said. Eleanor looked up at him, seeing not the dangerous stranger who had rescued her from a desperate situation, but the man who had chosen to build a life with her based on respect and partnership, rather than possession and control. "I know," she said. "I'm not sure I want to go back anyway." For the first time since coming to Red Creek, Eleanor felt like she truly belonged somewhere, not as a temporary solution to a community need, but as a woman who had found her place and her person in a harsh land that rewarded courage and punished hesitation. She was engaged to Wyatt Kane. In a few months, she would be Mrs. Eleanor Kane, teacher and wife and partner in whatever adventures lay ahead. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it filled her with something she hadn't felt in years: hope for a future that belonged to her by choice rather than circumstance. The faded wedding photograph tucked between the pages of Wyatt's Bible was discovered by accident when Eleanor knocked over his saddlebags while helping him carry supplies into the schoolhouse. The worn leather bags spilled their contents across the floor: trail rations, ammunition, a small leather journal, and the good book that slipped open to reveal its hidden treasure. Eleanor picked up the photograph with hands that trembled slightly, studying the formal portrait of a younger Wyatt standing beside a woman of extraordinary beauty. The bride wore white silk with pearl buttons, her dark hair elaborately arranged, her smile radiant with joy. Wyatt looked impossibly young, his face unlined by weather or worry, his expression soft with happiness. Eleanor had never seen him display. At the bottom of the photograph, in careful script, someone had written, "Wyatt and Catherine Kane, June 15, 1882, our new beginning." Eleanor stared at the date, calculating quickly. 5 years ago. Wyatt had been married 5 years ago, which meant, Eleanor. Wyatt's voice behind her was quiet, resigned. "You weren't supposed to see that." She turned to face him, the photograph still clutched in her hands. "You were married." "Yes. What happened to her?" Wyatt closed his eyes briefly, as if gathering strength for a confession he had hoped never to make. "She died. Catherine died in childbirth, along with our son." The simple statement hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She sank into her desk chair, trying to process this revelation and its implications for everything she thought she understood about Wyatt Kane. "When?" she asked softly. "October 1883. We'd been married 16 months. Wyatt moved to the window, staring out at the street as if seeing something far beyond Red Creek. She was so excited about the baby. Talked about it constantly, what we'd name him, how we'd raise him, what kind of man he'd become. Eleanor looked down at the photograph again, seeing Catherine Kane's joy with new understanding. This woman had been planning a future that would never arrive, celebrating a life that would end before it truly began. "I'm so sorry," Eleanor said, inadequate words for such profound loss. "The doctor said it happens sometimes, nothing anyone could have done differently." Wyatt's voice was carefully controlled, but Eleanor could hear the old pain beneath it. "One day I had a wife and was expecting a son. The next day I was alone, burying them both." Eleanor felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place: Wyatt's solitary lifestyle, his reputation for keeping people at a distance, his initial reaction to her desperate words about giving him sons. "That's why you helped me that day. When I offered to give you sons, you knew what that kind of loss felt like." "I knew what it was like to want something you'd never have," Wyatt said quietly. "And I knew those men were about to take away your choices the same way death took away mine." The revelation recontextualized every interaction they had shared. His patience with her independence, his careful respect for her autonomy, his insistence that the right person wouldn't ask her to give up who she was, all of it made sense now. He wasn't just protecting her from forced marriage, he was protecting her from the kind of relationship that left no room for individual identity. "Is that why you proposed?" Eleanor asked. "To save me from Chester Hawthorne and the town council, another rescue mission?" Wyatt turned from the window to face her directly. "It started that way," he admitted, "but it became something else." "What?" "It became the first time since Catherine died that I could imagine sharing my life with someone." His dark eyes were steady on hers. "You reminded me that partnership doesn't have to mean possession, that caring about someone doesn't have to mean controlling them." Eleanor felt tears threatening at the honesty in his voice. "But you must still love her. Catherine, how can you think about marrying someone else when you're still grieving your first wife?" Wyatt was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "I'll always love Catherine," he said finally. "She was my first love, the mother of my child, the woman who taught me what marriage could be at its best. But she's been gone for 4 years, Eleanor. I've done my grieving." "Have you?" "I thought I had," Wyatt said, But meeting you made me realize I'd been existing rather than living. Catherine wouldn't have wanted that for me. She'd have wanted me to find happiness again, to build something meaningful with someone who could appreciate what we had together without trying to replace it. Eleanor looked down at the photograph again, studying Catherine Kane's beautiful face. I could never replace her. I wouldn't want you to, Wyatt said simply. Eleanor, what Catherine and I had was precious and perfect and complete in its own way. What you and I might have would be different, built on different foundations, shaped by different experiences. That doesn't make it less valuable. Eleanor felt the truth of his words, but also the weight of what he was asking. How could she compete with a perfect memory, a love story cut short before reality could tarnish it? How could she build a future with a man whose heart already belonged to someone else? I need to think about this, she said, standing abruptly and moving toward the door. Eleanor, wait, please, she said without turning around. I just need some time to understand what this means for us. Eleanor spent the rest of the afternoon walking the hills outside Red Creek, trying to sort through her tangled emotions. She felt betrayed by Wyatt's failure to share such crucial information, even as she recognized that his past was his own to reveal or conceal. She felt sympathy for his loss and admiration for his resilience, even as she wondered whether she could ever measure up to a woman whose memory had been preserved in perfection. Most confusing of all, she felt jealous of a dead woman, jealous of Catherine Kane's beauty, jealous of her place in Wyatt's heart, jealous of the pure and uncomplicated love they had shared before life taught them about loss and compromise and the messiness of second chances. When she returned to town as evening shadows grew long, she found Wyatt waiting on her schoolhouse porch. He stood as she approached, his hat in his hands, his expression uncertain. I brought back the photograph, he said, offering her the worn image. Figured you might want to look at it again. Eleanor took the photograph, studying Catherine Kane's face in the fading light. She was beautiful. Yes, she was. And you loved her very much. I did. Eleanor looked up at him. Do you still? Wyatt met her gaze steadily. I love the memory of who she was and what we had together. But Eleanor, memories can't warm your bed at night or share your daily struggles or help you face an uncertain future. Memories can't build a new life with you, but they can make it impossible to fully commit to someone new, Eleanor said. They can create comparisons that no living person can win. Is that what you're afraid of? That I'll compare you to Catherine? Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. Wyatt stepped closer, close enough that she could see the sincerity in his dark eyes. Eleanor, I won't lie to you, there will always be a part of my heart that belongs to Catherine and the life we shared. But there's room for more than one kind of love in a person's heart. What I'm offering you isn't Catherine's leftover affection. It's something new, something that belongs to you alone. How can you be sure? Because the way I feel about you is different from anything I felt for Catherine, Wyatt said simply. Catherine was my first love, sweet and uncomplicated and full of dreams about our perfect future. You're my adult love, complex and challenging and real, in ways that teenage dreams never are. Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest at his words. Your adult love? The love of a man who's learned that life is uncertain and precious and not to be wasted on fear. Wyatt reached out to touch her face gently. Eleanor, I can't promise you that loving me will be easy. I carry scars from losing Catherine that will probably never fully heal. But I can promise you that what I'm offering is genuine, not a consolation prize or a substitute for something better, but a real partnership with a man who knows the value of what he's found. Eleanor looked down at the photograph one more time, then handed it back to Wyatt. Keep it, she said. Catherine was part of making you the man I'm falling in love with. I won't ask you to forget her. Wyatt's expression softened with relief and something deeper. And I won't ask you to live in her shadow. What we build together will be ours alone. Eleanor felt the last of her resistance crumble. Yes, Wyatt carried the memory of another woman, another love, another life. But he also carried the wisdom that came from loss, the appreciation that came from knowing how quickly happiness could disappear, and the courage to risk his heart again despite having it broken once before. Maybe that made him exactly the right person to trust with her own carefully guarded heart. "Wyatt," she said softly, "I want to try. I want to see if we can build something real together, something that honors your past while creating our own future." He smiled then, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his weathered face. "That's all I'm asking for, Eleanor, a chance to try." As they stood together on her schoolhouse porch, Eleanor realized that this revelation hadn't destroyed their relationship, it had deepened it. They were no longer two people play-acting at courtship to solve a social problem. They were two adults who had found each other despite pain and loss and the fear of risking their hearts again. It wasn't the simple romance of first love, but it was something potentially more valuable, the mature love of people who understood both the risks and rewards of genuine partnership. Eleanor was ready to find out what that might look like. Eleanor's father's leather satchel had been gathering dust in the corner of her bedroom for 5 years, unopened since the day she arrived in Red Creek. She had avoided it deliberately, knowing it contained the last remnants of her life before teaching documents and letters that belonged to a different version of herself, one with different dreams and different possibilities. Now, 3 days after learning about Catherine Kane, Eleanor found herself pulling the satchel from its hiding place and spreading its contents across her small table. Among the expected items, her teaching, college diploma, letters of recommendation, a few precious photographs of her parents, she discovered something that made her breath catch: a formal job offer from the California Department of Education. The letter was dated 6 months ago, offering her a position at a prestigious girls' academy in San Francisco. The salary was nearly double what she earned in Red Creek, the living quarters described as comfortable and private, the opportunities for advancement clearly outlined. Most intriguingly, the letter indicated that her contract could begin as late as January 1888, giving her time to fulfill her current obligations. Eleanor stared at the elegant letterhead, trying to remember why she had never responded to such an attractive offer. The position would provide everything she had told herself. She wanted: professional respect, financial security, independence in a cosmopolitan setting where unmarried women were less remarkable. It represented escape from the narrow confines of frontier life, from the constant scrutiny of small-town society, from the compromises she had been forced to make just to survive. It also represented escape from Wyatt Kane and the complicated feelings he had awakened in her. Eleanor set the letter aside and continued sorting through the satchel's contents. She found her father's last letter to her, written just weeks before his death, encouraging her to pursue her dreams wherever they might lead. She found her mother's wedding ring, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, a simple gold band, much like the one Wyatt had placed on her finger. She found a small notebook containing her own youthful plans and ambitions, dreams of teaching that extended far beyond the boundaries of any single community. As she read through her younger self's aspirations, Eleanor realized how much her perspective had changed during her years in Red Creek. The idealistic teacher who had arrived 5 years ago had envisioned herself as a civilizing influence, bringing culture and education to the frontier. The woman she had become understood that civilization was more complex than she had imagined, that communities were shaped by the people within them rather than imposed from outside. She also understood that love, real, adult love, was more complicated than the romantic fantasies of her youth. A knock at her door interrupted her reflections. Eleanor quickly gathered the scattered papers, her heart racing as she recognized Wyatt's distinctive rhythm. She opened the door to find him standing on her porch, his expression serious. "Eleanor," he said, "we need to talk." "Of course. Come in." Wyatt entered her small sitting room, his presence immediately making the space feel cramped. He noticed the open satchel, the scattered documents, the general atmosphere of upheaval. "Doing some cleaning?" he asked carefully. "Remembering," Eleanor replied, trying to understand what I want for my future. Wyatt's eyes moved to the California letter lying prominently on her table. Even upside down, the official letterhead was unmistakable. "Job offer?" he asked. Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. Wyatt picked up the letter, reading it slowly and thoroughly. When he finished, he set it down gently and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. "It's a good opportunity," he said finally. "Yes, it is. Better than anything Red Creek can offer you." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the resignation in his voice. "In many ways, yes." Wyatt was quiet for a long moment, studying his hands. "When would you need to leave?" "The letter says I could start as late as January. That would give me time to finish the current school term, help the town council find a replacement." Eleanor paused. "If I decided to accept, are you thinking about it?" Eleanor looked at this man who had become so important to her in such a short time, his weathered face, his patient eyes, his careful consideration of her feelings, even when discussing something that would take her away from him forever. "I don't know," she said honestly. 3 months ago, I would have accepted immediately. A position like this was everything I thought I wanted. And now I have to consider other factors, people who matter to me, commitments I've made." Eleanor gestured toward the engagement ring on her finger, "feelings I didn't expect to develop." Wyatt stood and moved to her window, looking out at the town they both called home. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully." "I'm listening." "If you want to take this position in California, you should take it. Don't let what's between us hold you back from an opportunity that could change your life." Eleanor felt her heart sink at his words. "Are you saying you don't want to marry me?" "I'm saying I want you to be certain about your choices," Wyatt replied, turning back to face her. "I don't want you to wake up in 5 years regretting what you gave up for a frontier marriage. I don't want you to resent me for standing in the way of your ambitions." "And what about what you want?" Eleanor asked. "What about your feelings?" Wyatt's expression softened. "My feelings don't matter if you're not happy. Eleanor, I've loved and lost before. I know what it's like to have dreams destroyed by circumstances beyond your control. But I also know the difference between loss and choice. If you leave Red Creek, it should be because you choose to, not because you feel trapped here." Eleanor felt overwhelmed by the generosity of his offer. He was giving her permission to walk away, to pursue a life that didn't include him, because he believed it might be better for her. It was the opposite of possessiveness, the opposite of the controlling behavior she had feared from marriage. "What if I asked you to come with me?" she said suddenly. "What if we both left Red Creek and started over somewhere new?" Wyatt considered this possibility carefully. "I'd follow you anywhere, Eleanor, but I need you to understand what that would mean for both of us." "What do you mean?" "In San Francisco, you'd be Mrs. Wyatt Kane, wife of a man with no education, no profession, no social standing. You'd be introducing me to your colleagues as a former ranch hand who knows horses better than books. That might limit your opportunities more than it expands them." Eleanor hadn't considered this aspect of their potential marriage. In Red Creek, Wyatt's reputation and capabilities made him a respected figure, despite his rough background. In a sophisticated city like San Francisco, those same qualities might mark him as unsuitable company for an educated woman seeking professional advancement. "It wouldn't matter to me," she said. "It might matter to your employers. It might matter to the parents of your students. It might matter to you, eventually, when you realize how much easier your life would be without a husband who doesn't fit into your professional world." Eleanor sank into her chair, overwhelmed by the complexity of their situation. Every path forward seemed to require sacrificing something important: her career or her relationship, his comfort or her ambitions, their present happiness or their future possibilities. "I don't know what to do," she admitted. Wyatt knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his large, calloused ones. "Eleanor, you don't have to decide tonight. Take time to think about what you really want, not what you think you should want or what other people expect you to want." What if I can't choose? What if every option feels like losing something I care about? Then you choose the option that feels most like gaining something you value, Wyatt said gently. And whatever you choose, you don't look back with regret. Eleanor looked down at their joined hands, her small, soft fingers intertwined with his large, work-roughened ones. They represented two different worlds, two different sets of possibilities, two different versions of who she might become. Wyatt, she said softly, if I stay in Red Creek, if we marry as planned, what would our life look like? Really look like, not the romantic version people imagine. Wyatt was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. We'd live simply. I have some land outside town, enough for a small ranch and a garden. You'd continue teaching as long as the community supported it. We'd raise whatever children God gives us, if any. We'd face the challenges of frontier life, together, drought, harsh winters, economic uncertainty. We'd grow old together in a place where everyone knows our business and judges our choices. And if I go to California, you'd have prestige, comfort, intellectual stimulation, opportunities for advancement. You'd live in a beautiful city with theaters and museums and libraries. You'd teach privileged girls who would go on to make their mark on the world. You'd be independent and respected and free to shape your own destiny. Droste. Eleanor closed her eyes, trying to envision both futures. One offered love and partnership but limited horizons. The other offered unlimited possibilities but no guarantee of personal happiness. How do I choose between two completely different lives? She asked. You figure out which one you can't imagine living without, Wyatt said simply. That night, Eleanor lay awake, staring at the ceiling, weighing her options with the careful deliberation she had once applied to lesson planning. The California position offered everything her ambitious younger self had dreamed of achieving. Marriage to Wyatt offered everything her lonely heart had learned to desire. Both choices carried risks, both required sacrifices, both would shape the rest of her life in ways she couldn't fully predict. As dawn approached, Eleanor realized that her decision wouldn't be made through logical analysis. It would be made through understanding which future felt more like home. The comfortable familiarity of Red Creek and the man who had become part of her daily life, or the exciting uncertainty of a new city and a prestigious position that matched her qualifications. She thought about her students, about the wooden rose on her desk, about the way Wyatt looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. She thought about Catherine Kane and the love that had been cut short, about her own parents and the dreams they had carried west, about the woman she had become during her years of teaching frontier children. By morning, Eleanor knew what she had to do. The question was whether she would have the courage to follow through with her decision, whatever the consequences might be. Wyatt's father's Colt revolver had been wrapped in oiled cloth and hidden beneath loose floorboards for 3 years, untouched since the day he had decided to leave his violent past behind. The weapon represented everything he had tried to escape: the hair-trigger temper of his youth, the casual brutality of frontier justice, the kind of man who solved problems with bullets rather than words. Now, as he unwrapped the familiar weight of the gun and checked its cylinder with practiced efficiency, Wyatt felt the old darkness rising in his chest. Chester Hawthorne had forced this moment, had pushed beyond reasonable boundaries into territory that could only be resolved through violence. The crisis had erupted that morning when Eleanor arrived at the schoolhouse to find the building's windows shattered, her desk overturned, and her precious books scattered across the floor in deliberate destruction. Someone had broken in during the night, methodically destroying months of careful preparation and years of accumulated materials. Worse than the physical damage was the message painted across the blackboard in red letters: "Whores don't teach our children." Eleanor had stood in the doorway of her ruined classroom, her face pale with shock and something deeper, a kind of soul-deep weariness that suggested this violation had broken something inside her that couldn't easily be repaired. Wyatt had arrived to find her sitting amid the wreckage, holding the pieces of her mother's brass bell, which had been deliberately smashed against the wall. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to fit the fragments together, as if repairing the bell could somehow restore everything else that had been destroyed. "I know who did this," she had whispered. Wyatt had knelt beside her, his own rage carefully controlled. "Are you certain?" "Chester Hawthorne was here yesterday evening after the children left. He made one final attempt to convince me to reconsider his proposal, to break my engagement with you and marry him instead." Eleanor's voice had been steady despite her tears. "When I refused, he said I would regret choosing you over a man who could provide real security. He said Red Creek had ways of dealing with women who made poor choices." Wyatt had felt something cold and deadly settle in his chest. Threats were one thing, he had dealt with those all his life. But attacking Eleanor through her work, destroying her classroom and her dignity, painting her as something vile and shameful that crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Eleanor," he had said carefully, "I want you to pack your things and stay with the Webbers tonight. Sarah's parents will understand why you need somewhere safe to be." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to have a conversation with Chester Hawthorne." Eleanor had looked at him with sudden fear in her eyes. "Wyatt, please don't do anything that can't be undone. He's not worth destroying your life over. He's not going to destroy yours either." Now, as afternoon shadows lengthened across Red Creek's main street, Wyatt walked toward Murphy's saloon with the Colt concealed beneath his jacket. He had no intention of drawing the weapon unless absolutely necessary, but Chester Hawthorne needed to understand that his campaign against Eleanor had consequences he might not be prepared to face. The saloon was busy for a Thursday afternoon, filled with ranch hands and townsmen seeking refuge from the late October heat. Conversations died as Wyatt entered, replaced by the kind of tense silence that preceded trouble. Word of the schoolhouse destruction had spread quickly through Red Creek, and everyone present understood why Wyatt Kane might be looking for Chester Hawthorne. Chester sat at a corner table with Tom Bradley and Harold Pettigrew, his posture radiating the satisfaction of a man who believed he had won a decisive victory. He looked up as Wyatt approached, his expression shifting from confidence to wariness. "Kane," Chester said, his voice carefully neutral, "heard there was some trouble at the schoolhouse last night. Did you?" Wyatt pulled out a chair and sat down uninvited, his movement casual but predatory. "Funny thing about that trouble, Chester, seemed awfully personal." "Property damage happens," Chester replied with studied indifference. "Kids get drunk, cause mischief. Nothing that can't be cleaned up." Wyatt leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes fixed on Chester's face. This wasn't kids causing mischief. This was someone with a specific grudge against Miss Price, someone who wanted to hurt her in the most personal way possible. Tom Bradley shifted nervously. "Now, Kane, you can't go around accusing people without proof." "I'm not accusing anyone," Wyatt said quietly. "I'm just observing that whoever destroyed that schoolhouse knew exactly how to cause the most damage. Knew which supplies were hardest to replace, which materials meant the most to Eleanor. Almost like they'd been watching her, studying her routines, planning their attack." Chester's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "Maybe you should be more concerned about finding the real culprit instead of harassing innocent citizens." "Innocent," Wyatt repeated thoughtfully. "That's an interesting word choice, Chester. Because the person who did this wasn't just vandalizing property. They were trying to destroy Eleanor's reputation, her livelihood, her future in this community." "Maybe Miss Price's reputation is already destroyed," Chester said, his mask of indifference beginning to slip. "Maybe someone just made that fact visible to everyone else." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dangerous fire. Around the saloon, conversations had stopped completely, as patrons recognized they were witnessing something that could turn deadly without warning. Wyatt's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness made Chester take an involuntary step backward in his chair. "Chester," Wyatt said softly, "I'm going to give you one chance to apologize for what you just said about Eleanor. One chance to show you're man enough to admit you spoke out of turn." "I don't have anything to apologize for," Chester replied, but his voice had lost its confidence. I'm just stating facts about a woman who's been living in sin with a man she's not married to." Wyatt stood slowly, his movement fluid and controlled. Every man in the saloon recognized the posture of someone preparing for violence. "Eleanor Price is one of the finest women in this territory," Wyatt said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "She's dedicated her life to educating children, improving this community, and conducting herself with dignity and grace. Anyone who suggests otherwise is either ignorant or malicious, or honest about what they've observed," Chester shot back, rising to meet Wyatt's challenge. "Some of us care more about protecting our children than protecting your whore of a fiancé." The insult landed like a physical blow. Wyatt felt the last restraints of civilization fall away, replaced by the cold fury that had once made him feared across 3 states. His hand moved instinctively toward the concealed Colt, muscle memory overriding years of careful self-control. But before he could draw the weapon, Chester made a fatal mistake. Emboldened by what he mistook for hesitation, he reached for his own gun, a clumsy, obvious movement that telegraphed his intentions to everyone present. Wyatt's hand moved with the fluid precision of a man who had survived countless such encounters. The Colt appeared in his grip as if by magic, its barrel centering on Chester's chest before the other man had cleared leather. "Don't!" Wyatt said quietly. Chester froze with his gun half-drawn, suddenly realizing he had initiated a confrontation he couldn't win. Around the saloon, chairs scraped as men moved away from potential crossfire. "Now," Wyatt continued, his voice conversational despite the deadly weapon in his hand, "you're going to apologize for what you said about Eleanor. You're going to acknowledge that she's a respectable woman deserving of community support. And you're going to explain to everyone here why you destroyed her classroom." "I never—" "Chester," the single word carried absolute finality. "I know it was you. You know it was you. The only question is whether you're going to admit it like a man or force me to prove it in ways that might be permanently uncomfortable for you." Chester's face was pale with sweat, his gun hand trembling slightly. He looked around the saloon for support, but found only neutral faces and calculating eyes. No one was going to risk Wyatt Kane's wrath to defend Chester Hawthorne's pride. Chester's voice cracked. "I was angry about the engagement, about Eleanor choosing you over me. So you destroyed her classroom? I thought if she couldn't teach anymore, she'd have to reconsider her options." A murmur of disgust rippled through the saloon. Even men who had supported Chester's position on Eleanor's marital status were appalled by his willingness to destroy a school to achieve his goals. "You thought wrong," Wyatt said. "Now apologize." "I'm sorry," Chester said quickly. "I'm sorry for what I said about Miss Price. She's a good teacher. She doesn't deserve what I did." Wyatt studied Chester's face for a long moment, then slowly holstered his weapon. The movement seemed to drain tension from the entire room. "Chester," Wyatt said quietly, "you're going to pay for the damage you caused. Every book, every supply, every piece of furniture. You're also going to stand up in church Sunday morning and apologize publicly to Eleanor and to this community for your behavior. And if I refuse?" Wyatt smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then we'll have another conversation, one that might not end with you walking away." Chester nodded hastily, his earlier bravado completely extinguished. "I'll pay for the damages. I'll apologize." "Good." Wyatt looked around the saloon, his gaze touching every face present. "Anyone else have concerns about Eleanor Price's character or her fitness to teach our children?" The silence was complete and definitive. Wyatt headed toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Chester, if Eleanor suffers any more mysterious accidents or anonymous harassment, I'm going to assume you're responsible. And next time, I might not be in such a forgiving mood." After Wyatt left, the saloon remained quiet for several minutes before conversations gradually resumed. Chester Hawthorne sat slumped in his chair, looking like a man who had just glimpsed his own mortality and found the experience profoundly sobering. Tom Bradley was the first to speak. "Chester, you damn fool. What did you think was going to happen? Chester didn't answer. He was too busy contemplating how close he had come to pushing Wyatt Kane past the point of no return, and how lucky he was to be alive to learn from his mistake. The school bell tower that rose from the center of Red Creek had been Wyatt's idea, proposed during an impromptu town meeting called to address the aftermath of the schoolhouse destruction. What had begun as a discussion about repairs and security had evolved into something larger, a community project that would demonstrate Red Creek's commitment to education and Eleanor's place within it. "We're not just fixing a building," Wyatt had told the assembled townspeople. "We're building something that will serve this community for generations. A proper school with a bell tower that can be heard from every farm and ranch in the valley, calling children to learn and neighbors to gather." The response had been overwhelming. Families who had never spoken publicly in Eleanor's defense suddenly found their voices, offering materials, labor, and financial support. The Webbers donated lumber from their sawmill. The Martinez family provided skilled stonework for the foundation. Even some of Chester Hawthorne's former allies quietly contributed to the effort, as if participation in the rebuilding could atone for their earlier hostility. Eleanor stood now in the framework of what would become her new classroom, watching Wyatt and a dozen other men raise the walls with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to building their futures with their own hands. The structure was larger than the original schoolhouse, with space for twice as many students and separate areas for different age groups. Windows on three sides would provide natural light throughout the day, and a small apartment attached to the rear would give Eleanor proper living quarters instead of the cramped rooms she had occupied for 5 years. But it was the bell tower that captured everyone's imagination, a tall, graceful structure that would house the new bronze bell donated by the territorial government in recognition of Red Creek's commitment to education. The tower would be visible from miles away, a symbol of knowledge and community rising from the frontier landscape. "Miss Price," Sarah Weber called from where she and several other children were sorting donated books. "Where do you want these readers?" Eleanor smiled at the young girl who had become her unofficial assistant during the rebuilding process. "Put them with the other primary texts, Sarah. We'll organize them properly once the shelves are finished." The children had embraced the reconstruction project with enthusiasm that surprised many adults. Timothy Carson had appointed himself supervisor of supplies, maintaining careful inventories of materials as they arrived. Emma Bradley had organized the younger children into cleaning crews, ensuring that salvageable items from the original schoolhouse were properly prepared for reuse. Billy Martinez had established himself as liaison between the English-speaking and Spanish-speaking workers, translating instructions and coordinating efforts with natural diplomatic skill. Watching them work, Eleanor felt a profound sense of gratitude for the community that had rallied around her. The destruction of her original classroom had been devastating, but the response to that destruction had revealed something beautiful about Red Creek. A shared commitment to the future that transcended individual differences and petty disputes. "Eleanor," Wyatt called from where he was working on the tower's framework. "Can you come here for a minute?" Eleanor made her way through the construction site, carefully stepping around piles of lumber and scattered tools. The building process had become a daily gathering place for the entire community, with people arriving throughout the day to contribute whatever time and skills they could spare. Wyatt stood at the base of the partially completed tower, a set of architectural drawings spread across a makeshift table. "I wanted to show you something before we finish the upper framework." Eleanor looked at the drawings, recognizing Wyatt's careful draftsmanship in the detailed specifications and measurements. "You drew these yourself?" "Had to learn to read plans when I was doing construction work down in Texas," Wyatt said. "Figured the skill might come in handy someday." Eleanor studied the drawings more carefully, noting features she hadn't expected: built-in cabinets for storing supplies, a small library alcove with window seats for reading, even a modest office space where she could meet privately with parents or work on lesson plans without interruption. "Wyatt," she said softly. "This is far more elaborate than anything we discussed. The expense alone—" "The community wants to do this right," Wyatt interrupted gently. "They want to build something that will serve Red Creek for the next 50 years, something their grandchildren will be proud of." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as she realized what the new school represented. It wasn't just a replacement for what had been destroyed. It was a statement of faith in her, in education, in the belief that Red Creek's future depended on its commitment to learning and growth. "There's something else," Wyatt said, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "Something I wanted to discuss with you privately." Eleanor looked up from the drawings to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. "What is it?" Wyatt glanced around to ensure they couldn't be overheard, then stepped closer. "Eleanor, I know you've been thinking about that position in California. I know you haven't made a final decision yet." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. She had been avoiding the subject of the California offer, hoping that her feelings would clarify themselves without forcing a confrontation with reality. "Wyatt, let me finish," he said gently. "I want you to know that whatever you decide, this school will be built. Whether you're here to teach in it or not, Red Creek is going to have the finest educational facility in the territory." The generosity of his statement took Eleanor's breath away. He was ensuring her legacy in Red Creek, regardless of whether she chose to be part of its future. "Why?" she asked. "Because you've shown this community what education can accomplish. You've proven that investing in children's minds is the best way to build a better future." Wyatt's voice grew softer. "And because I want you to choose your path freely, without feeling obligated to stay because of what we've built here." Eleanor looked around at the bustling construction site, at the children organizing books, at the adults working together to create something larger than any individual contribution. "What if I told you I've already made my choice? What choice is that?" Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling the weight of decision settle around her like a comfortable cloak. "I'm staying in Red Creek. I'm going to teach in this beautiful new school, and I'm going to marry you in the spring, and I'm going to help build whatever comes next for this community." Wyatt's expression transformed with relief and joy. "Are you certain?" The California position would have been perfect for the woman I was 5 years ago," Eleanor said. "But I'm not that woman anymore. I'm someone who belongs here, who's found her place and her people and her purpose." "And what about us? Are you choosing to stay because of me or in spite of me?" Eleanor smiled at the careful phrasing of his question. "I'm choosing to stay because of everything, because of you, because of this community, because of work that matters to me. I'm choosing a life that feels complete rather than just accomplished." Wyatt reached for her hands, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Eleanor, are you sure you won't regret giving up such an opportunity?" "The only thing I would regret is walking away from something real in pursuit of something that might never satisfy me." Eleanor looked into his dark eyes. Seeing the future they would build together reflected there. "I've spent 5 years learning who I am and what I want. What I want is a partnership with someone who values my independence, work that challenges and fulfills me, and a community where I can make a difference. I don't need to go to California to find those things. I've already found them here." Around them, the sounds of construction continued, hammers striking nails, saws cutting lumber, voices calling instructions and encouragement. The bell tower rose higher with each passing hour, reaching toward a sky that seemed impossibly wide and full of promise. "When should we set the wedding date?" Wyatt asked. "Spring," Eleanor said without hesitation. "After the school is finished and the children have settled into their routines. I want to start our marriage with a clean slate, with all the old conflicts resolved and new possibilities stretching ahead of us." Wyatt smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Spring it is. We'll have the ceremony right here, in the shadow of the bell tower. With the whole community watching, with the whole community celebrating," Wyatt corrected. "Eleanor, you've become part of Red Creek's heart. Our wedding won't just be about us, it'll be about this town's faith in the future." Eleanor felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. This was where she belonged, with this man, in this place, building something meaningful with people who had become her family. The sophisticated opportunities of San Francisco would always exist, but this particular moment, this specific choice, would never come again. She had chosen love over ambition, community over career advancement, the known over the unknown. And for the first time in her adult life, Eleanor Price felt completely certain she was making the right decision. The bell tower continued to rise against the autumn sky, a symbol of everything Red Creek was becoming and everything Eleanor had chosen to be part of. By spring, it would house a bronze bell whose clear notes would call children to learning and neighbors to fellowship, ringing out across the valley with the sound of hope and commitment and the promise that education and love could flourish even in the most unlikely places. Eleanor squeezed Wyatt's hands and turned back toward the school that would be her life's work, ready to help build the future they had chosen together. The simple gold wedding band that Wyatt slipped onto Eleanor's finger on a warm April morning in 1888 was not elaborate or expensive, but it had been chosen with careful thought. He had spent weeks consulting with the territorial jeweler in Junction City, describing exactly what he wanted: a ring that would suit a woman who valued substance over ornament, durability over decoration, meaning over monetary worth. The ceremony took place beneath the completed bell tower, just as they had planned, with the entire community of Red Creek gathered to witness the union of their schoolteacher and the man who had become her protector, partner, and in the months of rebuilding that had brought them closer together, her closest friend. Reverend Morrison performed the service with obvious pleasure, having watched Eleanor's integration into the community and Wyatt's transformation from solitary guardian to devoted suitor. The vows they exchanged were traditional in form, but deeply personal in meaning, each word carefully chosen and sincerely spoken. Do you, Wyatt Kane, take Eleanor Price to be your wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, for as long as you both shall live? I do, Wyatt said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. I promise to cherish Eleanor's independence, support her dreams, and build a life with her based on respect, partnership, and love. Do you, Eleanor Price, take Wyatt Kane to be your husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, for as long as you both shall live? I do, Eleanor replied, looking into Wyatt's eyes with complete certainty. I promise to honor the man Wyatt has become, the love we've discovered together, and the future we'll create as partners in all things. The moment Reverend Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, the new bronze bell rang out across the valley, not the traditional wedding chimes, but the clear, strong notes that would call children to learning for generations to come. It was Eleanor's idea, a symbolic beginning that connected their personal happiness to their shared commitment to education and community. The celebration that followed took place in the completed schoolhouse, with tables set up where desks usually stood and the walls decorated with wildflowers gathered by Eleanor's students. The feast was a community effort, every family contributing something to the meal, from Martha Weber's famous apple pies to Miguel Martinez's perfectly roasted beef. Eleanor moved through the crowd in her simple blue dress, not white, which would have been impractical for a frontier bride, but a deep sapphire that brought out her eyes and could serve as her best dress for years to come. She spoke with each guest, thanking them for their support during the difficult months that had led to this day. Mrs. Kane, Sarah Weber said, testing out Eleanor's new name with obvious delight. Are you going to keep teaching after you're married? Of course, Eleanor replied, kneeling to Sarah's level. Nothing about marriage changes my love for teaching or my commitment to helping you and the other children learn. My ma says some married ladies don't work outside their homes, Sarah said, with the directness of childhood. Some don't, Eleanor agreed. But Mr. Kane and I believe that the best marriages allow both people to do work they find meaningful. Teaching gives me purpose and joy. He wouldn't want me to give up something so important. Near the refreshment table, Chester Hawthorne approached with obvious reluctance. He had fulfilled his promise to pay for the damage he had caused and had made his public apology, but his presence at the wedding still created an undercurrent of tension. "Mrs. Kane," he said formally, "I wanted to offer my congratulations and my apologies one more time. My behavior last fall was inexcusable." Eleanor studied his face, seeing genuine remorse beneath the awkwardness. "Thank you, Mr. Hawthorne. I appreciate your honesty, and I hope we can move forward as neighbors who want the best for this community." Chester nodded, clearly relieved by her gracious response. "I've been thinking about what you said once, about education being the foundation of progress. My oldest boy will be ready for school next year. I hope you'll be patient with him. He's got more energy than sense most days." "I look forward to teaching him," Eleanor said sincerely. "Energetic children often make the most enthusiastic learners." As afternoon faded into evening, Eleanor found herself standing beside Wyatt on the schoolhouse porch, watching their neighbors gather their families and begin the journey home. The festivities had been perfect, joyful without being extravagant, meaningful without being solemn, exactly the kind of celebration that suited a couple who valued substance over show. "Any regrets?" Wyatt asked quietly, his arm around her waist. Eleanor considered the question seriously, thinking about the path that had led her to this moment. About choosing you, about staying in Red Creek, about becoming Mrs. Kane, instead of pursuing that position in California. About any of it. Eleanor looked out at the valley that had become her home, at the bell tower rising against the star-filled sky, at the faces of people who had become her family. "The only regret I have is that it took a crisis to help me realize what I really wanted." "And what's that?" "A life that feels complete rather than just successful. Work that matters to me, a partner who respects my choices, and a community where I can make a real difference." Eleanor turned to face her husband, still marveling at how natural that word felt. "I have all of those things here, with you." Wyatt smiled, that rare expression of unguarded happiness that had become more frequent as their relationship deepened. "What do you think comes next for us?" Eleanor thought about the future stretching ahead, the children she would teach, the improvements they would make to their land, the family they might create together if blessed with children, the quiet satisfaction of building something lasting in a place that valued both tradition and progress. "I think we take things one day at a time," she said. "We teach children. We care for each other. We help this community grow in wisdom and compassion. We prove that love doesn't have to diminish independence, that marriage can strengthen rather than constrain two people who choose to build a life together." "Sounds like a good plan to me," Wyatt said, pulling her closer. As they stood together in the doorway of the school that represented their shared values and mutual commitment, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. She had arrived in Red Creek as a young woman seeking purpose and had found something far greater, a place where she belonged, work that fulfilled her, and love that had grown slowly and surely from respect and partnership. The bell tower stood silhouetted against the night sky, a testament to what could be accomplished when a community committed itself to something larger than individual interests. Tomorrow, that bell would ring again, calling children to learn and neighbors to gather, marking the passage of days in a place where education and love could flourish side by side. Eleanor Price Kane, the name felt right. Carrying both her personal identity and her new partnership, had found her home in the most unlikely place, with the most unexpected man, through circumstances that had seemed like disaster but had proven to be destiny. Sometimes the loneliest people did make the most desperate promises, and sometimes those promises led to exactly where they were meant to be, with exactly who they were meant to love, in exactly the life they were meant to live. The brass bell that had once hung beside Eleanor's desk now occupied a place of honor in their small home, its dented surface polished until it gleamed. It no longer called children to lessons, but it served as a reminder of the journey that had brought two solitary souls together in a love that honored both their past pain and their future hopes. In the years that followed, when their own children asked about how their parents had met, Eleanor would tell them the story with gentle humor and deep appreciation for the unexpected ways that life could transform desperation into joy, loneliness into love, and fear into the courage to build something beautiful together. She would tell them that sometimes the best things in life came not from careful planning, but from the willingness to remain open to possibilities, to trust in the fundamental goodness of people, and to believe that love, real, mature, partnership-based love, could grow in the most unlikely soil and bloom into something stronger than either person could have imagined alone. And when the children were old enough to understand, she would explain that their father had saved more than her job or her reputation on that autumn day in 1887. He had saved her capacity to believe in love itself, and in return, she had given him the courage to open his heart again after loss had taught him to guard it so carefully. Together, they had built something that honored both their individual dreams and their shared commitment to each other and to the community that had become their home. It was exactly the kind of love story that could flourish on the frontier. Practical and passionate, respectful and romantic, grounded in reality, but reaching toward the stars that shone so brilliantly over the wide western sky.